Welcome back to Tartan Lullaby. I'm Archie, and tonight there's a long, quiet story waiting for you. Before we begin, take a moment to settle in. Find your pillow. Soften your shoulders. Let the day go. Tartan Lullaby tells slow stories of Scotland. Real places, real years, real people, told gently enough to fall asleep inside. There's no music tonight, and no need to follow every word. If you drift off in the first few minutes, the rest will play on quietly without you. That's how it's meant to be. If these stories are a quiet corner you find yourself returning to, a subscription would mean a great deal, and it helps us keep making them. The artwork you see throughout tonight's story is available as a print in our Etsy shop, if you'd like to bring a little of Scotland onto your walls. When you're ready, close your eyes and we'll begin. Tonight, the first of two nights on Haiti and the Scottish Caribbean. Sugar, ships, and the world they built. This is Tartan Lullaby, sleep history from Scotland. Settle yourself now. You are safe and you are warm. What follows tonight is history told honestly, and honestly means telling all of it. There is beauty in this story. There is also a truth that does not soften. We will hold both, and we will not look away from either. Picture a quay at Greenock. The Firth of Clyde, late afternoon. The light is low and copper-coloured. The water moves in long, slow swells. Wooden casks sit on the wet stones, stacked 2 and 3 high, bound with iron, stamped with marks from a place most of the men on this quay have never seen. The smell comes before anything else. Sweet and dark and faintly rotten. Sugar after months at sea. The casks are heavy. The men who roll them are cold. The ships that brought them have already turned or soon will. They are going back. They are always going back. Now hold a second image alongside the first. A shoreline in the Caribbean. The same hour, give or take, though the light there is different, amber and hazy, the air thick and still. The sea is a particular shade of blue-green that has no proper name in Scots. A sugar mill stands in the middle distance. We will not call it beautiful. The mill is a system, and the system is violence organized into commerce. What surrounds it is beautiful. The sea is beautiful. The sky is beautiful. The hills behind are beautiful. The thing men built here and what they did here is not. Tonight's story connects those two shores, a quay in Scotland and a shoreline in the Caribbean. They are 4,000 miles apart, and they are the same story. This channel tells its histories honestly. That is all we ask of ourselves, and it is a great deal to ask. So breathe slowly. Let the images settle. The copper light on the Clyde, the amber haze over the Caribbean. History lives in both places. We are going to walk through it together, and we are going to do it with our eyes open. Begin in Scotland in the early 1700s, a country that has just made a bargain it did not fully understand, with a partner it did not entirely trust. In a moment of desperation, it will not soon forget. The Acts of Union took effect in 1707. Scotland ceased to be a separate kingdom. The future arrived before anyone was ready for it. To understand why so many Scots went west in the decades that followed, you have to understand what Scotland looked like in the years just before. It looked like a country on its knees. The 1690s had been catastrophic. Harvest failures for several years in succession, famine in the countryside, perhaps 10% of the population dead, and then Darien. Darien is the wound that Scotland carries into the 18th century. The Company of Scotland, formed in 1695, was the country's great ambition, a trading empire of its own, independent of England, anchored in a settlement on the Isthmus of Panama. The idea was that Scotland would command the route between the Atlantic and the Pacific. It was an idea built on maps more than reality. The settlement at Caledonia on the Darien coast failed in ways that were systematic and brutal. Disease killed settlers faster than hardship. The Spanish were hostile. The English, crucially, withheld support. English colonists in the Americas were instructed not to trade with the Scottish colony. The first expedition landed in 1698. The colony was abandoned for the last time in 1700. The cost to Scotland was staggering. Estimates suggest that between 1.25% of all the liquid capital in the country was invested in the Darien scheme. Much of that was ordinary people's savings, as well as the fortunes of merchants and nobles. It was gone. The dreams of Scottish imperial commerce had tried to breathe once in a swamp and died. 7 years later, Scotland signed the Acts of Union. The causes are still argued over by historians, and the causes are genuinely complex. But among them, Scotland was financially broken, and England's Atlantic trade was closed to it so long as it remained outside the English system. The Union opened that door. What was behind the door was the British Empire, and specifically the Atlantic. From 1707, Scottish merchants could trade legally into England's colonial markets. Scottish ships could sail to the plantations in the West Indies and to the tobacco settlements of Virginia and Maryland without penalty. The ports of the Clyde, which had been pointing west and waiting, could now follow where they were pointing. This is the moment Glasgow begins its transformation. But it is not only Glasgow's merchants who look west. It is a whole stratum of Scottish society for whom the British Atlantic suddenly represents something that Scotland itself cannot offer, a future. And among the most numerous are younger sons. In Scotland, as in much of Britain, the eldest son inherits. The younger sons must find their own way. A younger son of a minor Ayrshire family, a younger son of a Perthshire minister, a younger son of a merchant in Aberdeen, a younger son of a farmer whose land could not be divided further. These men are the foot soldiers of Scottish emigration in the 18th century. The Caribbean does not promise them wealth, exactly. It promises them a chance at it, which is different. The West Indies in the early 1700s are already producing extraordinary fortunes. Sugar is the commodity that drives this. The islands of the British Caribbean, Jamaica above all, but also Barbados, Antigua, St. Kitts, Nevis, are producing sugar on a scale that transforms the Atlantic economy. Scottish merchants are watching this from the Clyde and the Forth, and they are boarding ships to be part of it. The roles they take are specific. Some go as merchants, setting up the counting houses and trading networks that will channel Caribbean goods back to Scottish ports. Some go as clerks, working under established planters or merchant firms, learning the ledgers and the language of the sugar trade from the ground up. A reliable Scottish clerk was considered, in the records of the period, a commodity worth finding. Others go as doctors. The plantation system consumed people at a rate that required a constant medical presence, or what passed for one. Scottish medical training, particularly from Edinburgh, was among the best in Europe by the mid-18th century. A trained physician with a degree from Edinburgh could find employment in the Caribbean almost immediately. The work was grim. The pay was good. Men went. Still others go as overseers. This is the role that sits most darkly in the record. An overseer on a sugar plantation was the man who managed the day-to-day operation of the enslaved workforce. He was often young, often poor, often desperate for the wage. He was also the man who enforced the system's violence at close range. The records give us Scottish names in this role, many Scottish names. The numbers the records suggest are sobering. Historians working on the Scottish presence in the Caribbean, including work published through the Scottish government's own inquiries in the early 2000s, have estimated that Scots were disproportionately represented in the plantation economy relative to their share of the British population. Scotland had roughly a fifth of Britain's people. In some Caribbean territories, Scots held closer to a third of the plantations. This is a finding that bears sitting with. Scotland was a small, poor country in 1707. Within a century, it had produced a planting class, a merchant class, and an administrative class spread across the British Caribbean, out of all proportion to its size. The Union gave the door. Poverty and ambition walked through it, and the system they walked into was built on enslaved human beings. It is worth saying plainly what that system was. Men, women, and children were taken from West and Central Africa by force. They were packed onto ships. The crossing, which the trade called the Middle Passage, lasted weeks. People died in the holds. Those who survived arrived in the Caribbean and were sold. They were sold as property. Scottish merchants bought them. Scottish planters worked them. The ledgers survive. The Argyll Archive, the records of the Douglas family, the accounts of merchant houses in Glasgow and Edinburgh, all carry entries that list human beings alongside casks of sugar and rolls of cloth. The language of those entries is the language of property, values, conditions, dispositions. We read those entries now and understand what the people who made them chose not to say plainly, which is that they were recording crimes. Scotland's entry into this system was not reluctant, it was eager. The Clyde merchants who moved into the tobacco trade first and then into sugar were not dragged into an English system against their will. They lobbied for access to it. They invested in it. They built fortunes from it that came home and built streets and institutions that are still standing, and in some cases still named after the men who built them. We are not telling this story to punish anyone alive today, or to diminish what Scotland built in other ways, or to suggest that Scottish people were uniquely cruel. The history of Atlantic slavery is a British history, a European history, a human history. But this channel is a Scottish channel, and Scotland's specific role in this story is the one we can tell with the most honesty, and the one we owe ourselves most clearly. The younger son from Ayrshire boards a ship at Greenock sometime in the 1730s or 1740s. We do not know his name. The ship is perhaps 200 tons. The crossing takes 6 weeks if the winds are kind. He is sick for most of it. He arrives at Kingston, Jamaica, or Bridgetown, Barbados, or at Basse-Terre in St. Kitts, and he steps ashore into a world that is nothing like Scotland, and that will require something of him he has perhaps not yet decided whether he will give. What the records suggest about those men who went and stayed is this: most of them gave it. Most of them did what the system required. A few left or tried to leave. A few wrote letters home that expressed discomfort or worse. But most of them managed the system, recorded the system, profited from the system, and sent the profits home. The money came back. The people who earned it for them never did. To understand what Scotland was invested in, you have to understand the sugar world, not as romantic or adventurous, because it was neither, as an industrial system that happened to take place in a tropical landscape. Sugar in the 18th century is as close to a modern extractive industry as the period produces. It requires capital, labor, logistics, and the willingness to use force. All of these were present in abundance. The crop itself is brutal work. Sugar cane grows tall and dense. At harvest, the cane is cut by hand, close to the ground with a machete. The cutters work in rows, moving through the field in heat that the records describe repeatedly as extreme. The cut cane must be processed quickly, within hours, before the sugar in the stalk begins to degrade. This means the mills run without stopping at harvest. The people running them do not stop either. The mill is the center of the plantation. The cane is fed between great rollers, powered by wind or water or animal force, and the juice is pressed out and channeled into a boiling house. In the boiling house, the juice is reduced through a series of copper kettles in descending stages of heat. The workers who tend those kettles stand over open flame. Burns are common. The record is plain about this. The enslaved people who worked the sugar plantations worked under conditions that the plantation owners' own documents describe, without apparent awareness of the indictment they are making, as more physically demanding and more dangerous than almost any other form of agricultural labor in the Atlantic world. The mortality rate on sugar islands was such that the enslaved population could not maintain itself through natural increase. The trade had to keep supplying people to replace those who died. This is the fact that sits at the center of the whole system. It consumed human lives faster than it could reproduce them. The trade in enslaved people was not incidental to the sugar economy. It was structurally necessary to it. Without a continuous supply of enslaved Africans, the sugar plantations would have stopped within a generation. Every Scottish merchant who bought sugar, every Glasgow counting house that financed a plantation, was financing that supply. The numbers are very large. Historians estimate that between 1500 and 1900, somewhere in the region of 12.5 million people were forcibly transporting from Africa to the Americas. The great majority of those, perhaps 10 million or more, were transporting after 1650, at the height of the sugar economy. British ships, including many fitted out from Scottish ports, carried a significant share of that number. We do not linger on this for effect. We state it because it is the truth, and because the sugar in those casks on the Greenock Quay has a cost attached to it that is not written on the cask. The cask says the name of the plantation. The cask says the weight and the grade. The cask does not say what it cost to fill it. We are saying it now quietly because it deserves to be said. The money from the Caribbean came back to Scotland, and the shape it took when it arrived tells you a great deal about how thoroughly the country absorbed the benefits of the system it had invested in. It came back as buildings. It came back as land. It came back as the endowment of institutions. It came back as the names on the buildings and the streets and the institutions that Scotland uses today. Glasgow is the most documented case and the most instructive. The tobacco lords of the mid-18th century, who made their fortunes in the Virginia and Maryland trade, were followed and in some cases overlapped by the sugar merchants. Men like Alexander Houston, whose firm Houston and Company was among the largest Glasgow sugar traders, built houses, bought land, and invested in the infrastructure of a city that was transforming itself from a modest cathedral town into a commercial capital. The Sterling Maxwell family, the Dunlops, the Oswalds. These names appear in the records of both the Caribbean trade and the physical fabric of Scottish life. Oswald's fortune, built substantially on plantation investment in the Caribbean and on the slave trade itself, purchased land in Ayrshire and financed connections to the highest levels of British politics. Richard Oswald of Auchincruive, to give him his full name, was a negotiator at the Treaty of Paris in 1783. The world he helped shape had been built, in part, on human traffic. The universities received money from men enriched by the Caribbean. The churches received money. Hospitals were funded by men whose wealth traced back, at some remove or directly, to the labor of enslaved people in sugar fields. This is not a fringe finding from polemical historians. It is documented in the Legacies of British Slave Ownership database, compiled by scholars at University College London, which traces the compensation paid to slave owners after the Abolition Act of 1833 and the uses to which that compensation was put. When Britain abolished slavery in 1833, it did not compensate the enslaved people for their centuries of unpaid labor. It compensated the people who had owned them. The compensation paid out by the British government was £20 million, a sum equivalent to roughly 40% of the government's annual budget at the time. Scottish owners received a substantial portion of that sum. The enslaved people received nothing. They were required to continue laboring under an apprenticeship scheme for several more years. We say this here in this chapter because it is necessary context for the Scottish story. The fortunes that came home to Glasgow and Edinburgh and Ayrshire were not earned in the way that word is usually used. They were extracted. They were extracted from land, from climate, from commodity markets, and from the bodies of people who had no say in the arrangement. Scotland built something real with that money. It is right to know where the money came from. Now we move to the island that will become Haiti. In the 18th century, it is called Saint-Domingue, the western third of the island of Hispaniola, and it is a French colony. It is not primarily a Scottish story, this part, but it is the story into which the Scottish Caribbean is woven, because the sugar economy of Saint-Domingue is the sugar economy taken to its furthest extreme, and what happens there changes everything. By the 1780s, Saint-Domingue is the most productive colony in the world. The records are specific. It produces roughly 40% of Europe's sugar and more than half of its coffee. It is sometimes described by historians of this period as the Pearl of the Antilles, a name the colonists gave it. The name does not survive the scrutiny of what it took to produce those numbers, but the numbers themselves are real and extraordinary. The population of Saint-Domingue in the 1780s is divided in a way that is itself a kind of violence. At the top, roughly 30,000 white colonists, the Grand Blancs who own the land and the mills. Below them, a class of roughly 30,000 free people of color, many of them of mixed ancestry, some of them extraordinarily wealthy, some of them slave owners themselves, all of them legally subordinate to white colonists regardless of their wealth. And at the base of all of it, approximately 500,000 enslaved people. They outnumber the white population more than 16 to 1. They work the cane and the coffee. They run the mills and the boiling houses. They build the roads and maintain the great houses. The colony's extraordinary productivity rests entirely on their labor. Without them, there is nothing. No sugar, no coffee, no pearl of the Antilles, no fortune. The conditions of their lives are documented, including in the accounts of people who observed them with something like sympathy, which was not common among those who profited from the system. The Code Noir, the French legal framework governing slavery in its colonies, specified what was theoretically owed to enslaved people in terms of food, clothing, and limits on punishment. The records suggest that in Saint-Domingue, the Code Noir was treated as a distant ideal, not a binding constraint. Punishment for resistance or disobedience was severe. The records use terms that we will not repeat in detail. It is enough to say that what the record describes is systematic cruelty maintained at scale, directed at people who had been stripped of every legal protection and most human acknowledgement. The managers of this system were not monsters in the way that makes them exceptional. They were ordinary people doing what the system rewarded. That is the more troubling truth. Scottish names appear in Saint-Domingue too, though less numerously than in the British Caribbean. Some are merchants with trading relationships that cross colonial lines. Some are physicians, as in the British Islands. Some are the younger sons again, working under French employers, managing French-owned properties. The Atlantic economy is porous in ways that nation-state boundaries do not fully capture. A man from Lanarkshire might work a French plantation if the wage was offered and the crossing was possible. By the late 1780s, Saint-Domingue is beginning to show the pressures that extraordinary extraction always produces in the end. The enslaved population is not passive. The record is clear on this, even though it is a record kept largely by people who feared and opposed what they were observing. There are networks of communication. There are religious practices brought from Africa and adapted in the Caribbean. There are plans that take years to ripen. It is 1789. In France, the old order is breaking. The revolution produces its declarations: liberty, equality, the rights of man. These words travel across the Atlantic as words do. They arrive in Saint-Domingue, and they do not mean the same thing to everyone who hears them. To the Grand Blancs, they might mean autonomy from the French crown. To the free people of color, they mean something more urgent and specific. To 500,000 enslaved people, they mean something else again. The summer of 1789 passes. The summer of 1790 passes. The sugar harvest continues. The mills turn. The ships load at the docks. From the outside, Saint-Domingue still looks like what it has always been, the most productive colony in the world, orderly in the way that a thing is orderly when enough force is applied to maintain order. But the force is not unlimited. And the people it is applied to are human beings who know what freedom is, because they remember what it was taken from. We are on the eve of 1791 now. In the hills above the northern plain of Saint-Domingue, something is being decided. The records give us the name of a ceremony at a place called Bois Cayman, held in August of 1791. The records give us names: Dutty Boukman, a man described as a coachman and a leader, a man who speaks and is listened to. What is said at Bois Cayman is not recorded in full by anyone present. What happens next is. Tonight we rest here on the eve. The sugar world at its height, the fortunes already built and building, the Clyde already changed by what came from these islands, and 500,000 people in Saint-Domingue who have not yet shown the world what they are going to do. Tomorrow night, the revolution, what it cost, what it won, what it built. Sleep now gently. The history will be here when you wake. Haiti and the Scottish Caribbean, Part 1 of 2, Block 2, Chapter 2. The Sugar World. Chunk 1. Sugar is the reason for almost everything that follows. Not spices, not gold, not the furs of northern rivers. Sugar. By the mid-18th century, it is the most valuable commodity moving across the Atlantic. Empires are arranged around it. The lives of millions are destroyed to produce it. Chunk 2. The Caribbean islands are well suited to cane. The soil is deep. The growing season is long. Rainfall comes in season. What the islands lack, in the view of European planters, is labor. Their answer to that absence becomes one of the greatest crimes in recorded history. Chunk 3. The trade in enslaved Africans runs for roughly 4 centuries. Between the 1500s and the mid-1800s, the records indicate that somewhere between 12 and 13 million people are taken from the African continent by force. They are loaded onto ships. They are transporting across the Atlantic. They are sold. Chunk 4. The crossing is known as the Middle Passage. Historians have studied the ship logs, the insurance claims, the cargo manifests. The numbers are large enough to be abstracted if you allow them to be. The practice here is not to allow that. Chunk 5. Enslaved people are packed into the holds of ships in conditions the ship's own surgeons record as dangerous. The records note disease, thirst, suffocation, despair. On many voyages, between 10 and 20% of those aboard die before reaching land. On the worst voyages, more. Chunk 6. Some captains note resistance, hunger strikes, attempts at uprising, refusals to comply. The records are written by the captors. What the enslaved people themselves felt and chose and endured is mostly not recorded. It was not considered worth recording. That silence is part of what this history asks you to hold. Chunk 7. Those who survive the crossing are brought ashore in Caribbean ports. They are examined. They are assessed. They are given prices. A ship's manifest from Jamaica in the 1760s lists them as it would livestock, age, apparent condition, price paid. The language of the ledger is the language of property. Chung 8. That language was not accidental. It was constructed, legally enforced, and morally defended by those who profited from it. To name someone property is to remove the legal category of person. It is a fiction that required constant violence to maintain. It required laws, courts, churches, and newspapers to sustain it. Chunk 9. On a sugar plantation, the work does not stop. Cane grows year-round. At harvest, it must be cut and processed quickly before the sucrose deteriorates. The boiling houses run through the night. Shifts do not end because the workers are tired. They end when the sugar demands it. Chunk 10. The mortality rate among enslaved people on sugar plantations is higher than on other colonial crops. The work is brutal and relentless. Boiling house accidents are common: scalding, amputation, burns. The records of plantation doctors show these injuries in dry clinical language. Behind the language is a person who had a life before the ship came. Chunk 11. Planters imported more enslaved Africans not because they were expanding operations, but because the existing workforce was dying faster than it was being born. The plantation system consumed people. That consumption was not hidden. It was costed into the accounts as a normal line of expenditure. Chunk 12. The enslaved people who survived built something extraordinary despite everything done to prevent it. They built cultures, languages, kinship networks, spiritual practices. They planted provision grounds and fed themselves when planters would not. They remembered. They organized. The archive of their resistance is incomplete, but it is there. Chunk 13. Against all of this, the sugar moved. It moved in barrels and hogsheads onto ships. It moved into the refineries of Bristol and London and Greenock. It moved into the kitchens of people who never visited a plantation and never asked where it came from. It moved into the price of everything. Chunk 14. Now comes the part of the story that asks something more specific of this country. Scotland does not stand at a distance from the plantation system. Scotland is inside it at almost every level and has been for generations by the time the late 1700s arrive. Chunk 15. The entry point for many young Scots is modest. A bookkeeper on a Jamaican estate is not a man of standing. He records the daily labor tallies, the crop weights, the sick lists. He is often young, often poor, often sent out by a family that has connections but little money. He arrives, he acclimatizes, he learns the system. Chunk 16. The system he learns is built on the control of enslaved people. A bookkeeper's duties include witnessing punishment. He records it in the log. He does not usually administer it, not at first, but he is present. His continuation in the post requires his acceptance of what he sees. Many accept it. The records show they do. Chunk 17. Above the bookkeeper is the overseer. The overseer's role is the enforcement of labor. He is responsible for output. If the crop falls short, he answers for it. The pressure flows downward. What stands between the overseer and the enslaved people is the whip, the lockup, the threat of sale. He uses them. Chunk 18. The plantation attorney is a step above. He manages the estate, often absentee-owned, in the owner's name. He receives correspondence from Scotland or England. He sends back accounts. He is a professional man, often trained in Scots law, managing an enterprise that rests entirely on the uncompensated labor of people held by force. Chunk 19. The plantation doctor occupies an unusual position. His role is to preserve the workforce because the workforce represents capital. His case notes survive in some Jamaican archives. They record injuries and illnesses with clinical detachment. They also sometimes record the cause, punishment, overwork, the conditions of confinement. The notes rarely editorialize. Chunk 20. Some doctors wrote privately. A small number of journals and letters survive in Scottish collections. In them, some men express discomfort, even distress, at what they witness. Very few leave. Very few speak publicly. The income was too good, the professional network too valuable, the social cost of dissent too high. Chunk 21. Then there are the owners. Not all plantation owners are absentee. Some Scottish men spend years in the Caribbean building estates. They marry, sometimes enslaved or formerly enslaved women, sometimes by coercion, and the records there are largely silent in ways that speak their own truth. They accumulate, they return. Chunk 22. When they return to Scotland with money. With it they buy land, which in Scotland means status. They commission houses, they enter Parliament, they sit on the boards of banks, they endow churches, their names go above doors. The wealth is transformed into respectability with great efficiency. Chunk 23. The fortunes built in this way are not peripheral to Scottish history. They are central to it. Historians studying the records of the Clyde tobacco and sugar trades, the ledgers of West India merchants, the estate records of families in Lanarkshire and Ayrshire and Perthshire have found the connections to be pervasive. This is not a fringe story. Chunk 24. Glasgow in the 18th century grows because of Atlantic trade. The Trongate, the merchant city, the grand houses of the tobacco lords, these are built with money that flows through the plantation system. Some of that money comes directly from sugar. Some comes from the trade goods sent out to purchase enslaved people. The chain is not long. Chunk 25. The financial instruments of the period tie Scottish banks and investors to plantation mortgages. An enslaved person could be listed as collateral on a loan. That loan might be held by a bank in Edinburgh. The bank's depositors might include a minister of the kirk, a professor of moral philosophy, a lawyer who believed in natural rights. Chunk 26. Here is where the moral architecture of the age requires examination. The system did not persist because every person in it was a monster. It persisted because ordinary people in ordinary institutional settings chose not to look, or looked and found reasons, or looked, felt something, and then returned to their accounts. Chunk 27. The Scottish Enlightenment produces some of the sharpest writing in the world on liberty, natural law, and the rights of persons. Francis Hutcheson, David Hume, Adam Smith. These men write in Glasgow and Edinburgh. They are aware of the plantation system. Their relationship to it is complicated, and that complication is worth naming plainly. Chunk 28. Hutcheson teaches that slavery is a moral wrong. His students include many who later manage plantations. Hume writes that he is suspicious of the capacity of African peoples for civilization. He is wrong, provably, by the evidence of the cultures those people build under conditions designed to destroy them. He is not corrected in his lifetime. Chunk 29. Adam Smith argues that free labor is economically more efficient than enslaved labor. He is writing within a system that does not change because of his argument. The men who profit from that system sit in the same university buildings where Smith lectures. They do not find his arguments persuasive enough to act on. Chunk 30. The Church of Scotland's record in this period is not straightforward. Some ministers preach against the trade. A small number of presbyteries send formal objections. But the Kirk as an institution does not make abolition a condition of membership or of respectability. Men who own plantations are baptized, married, buried with full rights. Chunk 31. Some individual ministers go further. They draw on natural law and scriptural equality to argue that no Christian should hold another person in bondage. Their arguments are heard, debated, and largely set aside. The economy of the congregations around them is too tied to the trade. The silence of institutions is a kind of answer. Chunk 32. There are also Scottish voices that justify the trade directly. Some argue from scripture, some argue from science, using pseudo-classification systems to define African people as a lesser category of humanity. These arguments are not fringe positions. They appear in university lecture rooms. They appear in general circulation pamphlets. Chunk 33. What is remarkable, in retrospect, is not that these arguments were made. Bad arguments have always been made in defense of bad interests. What is remarkable is how completely they were maintained across generations by educated people in a culture that simultaneously produced some of the clearest thinking in the world on human dignity. Chunk 34. That contradiction is not resolved in this story. It is presented. Scotland in the 18th century holds both things at once, a tradition of rigorous moral thought and an economy partially built on the absolute denial of the humanity of others. The holding of both things, without pretending one cancels the other, is what honest reckoning requires. Chunk 35. The enslaved people inside that system are not passive. The record makes this clear. Work slowdowns, deliberate damage to equipment, the careful preservation of languages and beliefs that the plantation sought to erase, the maintenance of extended family networks across different estates. These are forms of persistence that required courage and intelligence. Chunk 36. Larger acts of resistance occur throughout the Caribbean. Jamaica has a long history of maroon communities, people who escaped the plantations and established free settlements in the island's interior. The British fight two major wars against the Maroons and are ultimately forced to negotiate. The Maroons are not defeated. This matters. Chunk 37. In the French colony of Saint-Domingue, resistance also has a long history. Individual acts, small uprisings, the poisoning of masters by those who knew the plants, organized escapes. None of these, before 1791, overthrow the system, but they mark it. They remind those who manage the plantations that what they hold is held by force alone. Chunk 38. Saint-Domingue by the late 1780s is the most productive colony in the Americas. It produces more sugar than all of the British Caribbean combined. It produces more coffee than any other colony in the world. Its output is extraordinary. The cost of that output in human lives and human suffering is also extraordinary. Chunk 39. The colony has roughly 500,000 enslaved people. It has perhaps 30,000 free people of color, many of them of mixed descent, some of them wealthy, some of them slave owners themselves. It has about 40,000 white colonists. These groups are not unified. The tensions between them run deep and bitter. Chunk 40. The free people of color occupy a legal position designed to humiliate. They may own land and property. They may not vote. They may not sit with white colonists in church or in public. They may not wear the same clothes. They are subject to a web of regulations designed to remind them daily of their designated place. Chunk 41. Vincent Auge is a free man of color, educated in France, wealthy by the standards of the colony. In 1790, inspired partly by the news from Paris, he returns to Saint-Domingue and leads an uprising demanding political rights for free men of color. He is careful, fatally careful, to exclude enslaved people from his demands. Chunk 42. Auge is captured. He is brought to Cap Francois. He is broken on the wheel. His uprising fails, and its failure is a signal. No partial reform will satisfy either side of what is building in the colony. The planter class will not yield even to the educated and propertied free men of color. Something larger is preparing. Chunk 43. The enslaved people of Saint-Domingue are watching all of this. They have their own networks, their own intelligence, their own reading of what the upheaval in France means for a colony built on the claim that some people are not people. In Boys Cayman, in the north of the colony, in August 1791, they will act. Chunk 44. But that is part 2. For now, let the weight of what has been described settle quietly. The ships, the ledgers, the tobacco mansions, the Kirk silences, the philosophies and their failures. The ordinary men who went out to the Caribbean and came back wealthy and unremarkable. The 500,000 people who never got to come back at all. Chunk 45. The night before the revolution is a night like other nights on the plain of the north. The cane stands in the fields, the boiling houses cool. Somewhere in the hills, the people who will change the world are preparing. History is almost at the point where it can no longer hold what has been built into it. End of Block 2, Chapter 2, The Sugar World, Approximate Word Count, 2,960. Chunk Count, 45. All chunks within the 4085 word limit. Ends on the eve of August 1791, pointing to Part 2. The River Clyde runs wide and grey through the city of Glasgow. Stand on its north bank and look west. The water moves toward the sea, the same sea that once carried ships in both directions, west to the islands, east with what those islands produced. The money came home. That is the plain fact at the center of this chapter. Fortunes made in the Caribbean, built on the labor of enslaved people, returned to Scotland and were folded into the stone and mortar of a city. They built streets. They built mansions. They built institutions that still stand. We are not making an accusation. We are reading the record. The record is clear. Glasgow had been a modest trading town before the Atlantic trade found its rhythm. By the early 18th century, it was something else entirely. Merchants who had grown wealthy on tobacco looked west again, and what they found was sugar. The American War of the 1770s cut the tobacco trade sharply. Glasgow's imports from Virginia and Maryland fell to a fraction of what they had been. Fortunes contracted, but the men who held those fortunes were not finished. They redirected their capital toward the Caribbean. Sugar and cotton from the West Indies filled the gap. New firms formed or old ones pivoted. The Clyde became as much a sugar river as a tobacco river. The city adapted, and the money kept flowing. Around 150 West India merchants and planters operated out of Glasgow by the later years of Caribbean slavery. Some had personal stakes in the islands. Others managed the trade at a distance, taking commission, advancing credit, handling the refineries and the warehouses on the Scottish end. The records suggest that by the late 18th century, roughly 1/3 of Jamaican plantations were in Scottish hands. Glasgow was not a bystander in the plantation economy. It was a principal. Consider the firm of Alexander Houston and Company. Its partners imported sugar and cotton from Jamaica and the Windward Islands. The firm held 7 plantations in Grenada. By 1796, those plantations had returned a profit in the region of £400,000. That sum in the currency of the time was staggering. It could build a great house, buy a country estate, endow a family for generations, and it did exactly that. William Cunningham came from Ayrshire. He traded in tobacco and then in sugar, and he owned a plantation in Jamaica. The records name around 300 enslaved people on that estate. Cunningham became one of the wealthiest men in Glasgow. He built himself a house in the center of the city. It stood on the corner of Ingram Street and Queen Street. A Palladian townhouse, broad-fronted and assured, the kind of building that announces its owner has arrived. The wealth behind it came, in part, from that plantation in Jamaica. That building still stands. It is the gallery of modern art. Tens of thousands of people walk past it every year. The record of where the money came from is not hidden. It has simply not always been told. The Oswald family arrived at their fortune through the same trade, though their involvement was more direct. Richard Oswald was a Glasgow-born merchant who became one of the most significant slave traders in the British Atlantic world. Oswald and his associates purchased a trading station on Bance Island in the estuary of what is now Sierra Leone. It was one of the busiest transit points on the West African coast. Enslaved people were held there before being loaded onto ships bound for the Americas. Oswald grew rich. He purchased the Auchincruive estate in Ayrshire and built a house there to a design by Robert Adam. The grounds were laid out with care. The house was handsome. The architect was the finest in the country. The wealth that paid for Auchincruive passed through Bance Island. That is not an inference. It is what the records show. The Dennistoun family ran one of the leading West India houses, Dennistoun, Buchanan and Company. They imported sugar from the West Indies and resold rum, cotton, indigo and coffee. When slavery was abolished and the British government paid compensation to those who had held enslaved people as property, the Dennistoun's trustees filed a claim for 253 enslaved people in Trinidad. The compensation register is one of the most revealing documents the period left behind. It lists names, it lists amounts, it lists the people who were held and the people who were paid. The Dennistowns were there, so were many other Scottish names. Among absentee claimants who received that compensation, residents of Scotland were overrepresented. Scots made up around 10% of the British population. They accounted for around 15% of the claimants. The proportional weight of Scotland's involvement in plantation slavery was considerable. The money did not stay abstract. It was translated into land and stone. The merchant class of Glasgow built outward from the old city into new streets and squares, and they gave those streets their names. Buchanan Street carries the name of Andrew Buchanan, a merchant who made his fortune in the tobacco trade on slave-worked plantations. He became Lord Provost of Glasgow. The street named for him is still the main shopping thoroughfare of the city. Jamaica Street was opened in 1763 at the height of the rum and sugar trade. Its name is not incidental. Jamaica was the largest sugar island in the British Caribbean, and Glasgow merchants had extensive interests there. The street acknowledged that connection openly. Virginia Street recalls the tobacco plantations of the American colonies worked by enslaved Africans. Tobago Street, Antigua Street. The map of the merchant city is, in part, a map of the plantation world. The islands and colonies that made the money are written into the ground. These names were not accidents or casual geographies. They were acts of identification. The men who named those streets were telling the city, and perhaps telling themselves, where the wealth had come from. The mansions came too. The tobacco lords had built along the western edge of the old town, and their sugar successors followed the same instinct. A grand house in the city, a country estate within a day's ride. The great estates of Lanarkshire and Ayrshire and Renfrewshire absorbed plantation wealth. Land was bought, houses were improved, parks were laid out. The architecture of rural Scotland in the late 18th century carries, in many places, the financial signature of the Caribbean. This was not merely a matter of comfort. Land ownership in Scotland conferred status and political weight. The merchant who bought an estate moved from the trading class into the landed class. His sons would sit in county councils. His grandsons might sit in Parliament. The West India interest in Scottish and British politics was organised and effective. In Glasgow, the West India Association gave the trade a collective voice. It lobbied against any interference with the plantation system. It defended the profits of its members with the tools of parliamentary influence. The association's chairman, James Ewing of Strathleven, sat in Parliament. He spoke in favour of the system. He was not alone. The West India interest could count on a significant number of allies in the House of Commons, men whose wealth, or whose constituents' wealth, depended on the continuation of Caribbean slavery. This was not fringe politics. It was the mainstream interest of a substantial portion of the Scottish commercial class, represented through legitimate channels, pressing its case with money and with votes. The same wealth found its way into institutions. The University of Glasgow received donations from men whose fortunes had Caribbean roots. Robert Bogle, a West India merchant who held enslaved people in considerable numbers, contributed to the construction of university buildings. The university would later commission its own accounting of this history. The report it published found that 23 individuals with connections to slavery had donated money toward the development of its Gilmore Hill campus in the latter half of the 19th century. The figures involved, calculated in the value of later centuries, ran into the tens of millions and possibly higher. The institution acknowledged this. The acknowledgement was not comfortable. It was necessary. Banks and counting houses in Glasgow were seeded in part by the same capital. West India merchants served as informal bankers within the trading community, advancing credit, accepting sugar as security, lending against future harvests. Their money moved through the commercial system. The Thistle Bank counted men from the West India trade among its principals. The broader pattern was the same everywhere. Plantation wealth circulated through Glasgow's financial institutions, and those institutions grew on it. None of this is hidden history exactly. The names are on the streets. The houses are in the records. The compensation register is a public document. What has sometimes been missing is the willingness to hold these things in the same frame and read them steadily. A man built a beautiful house. That is true. His architect was gifted. That is true. The grounds are lovely. That is also true. and the money that paid for all of it came from the forced labor of people who had no choice in the matter and no share in the proceeds. That is equally true. The two truths do not cancel each other. They stand together. That is what this chapter asks you to hold, beauty and its source, at once, without looking away from either. Glasgow's merchants were not uniquely monstrous. They operated within a system that their parliament sanctioned, that their churches rarely challenged, and that the wider British economy required. They were doing what successful men of their era did. But that context is not an absolution. It is an explanation of how the system continued as long as it did. The men who held the ledgers knew what was in them. The entries were clear. Some Scots did oppose the trade. The abolitionist movement found support in Glasgow. When a petition against slavery was circulated, roughly 39,000 people signed it. Signatures were collected at 20 churches and 18 shops. That was a quarter of the city's population at the time. The petition mattered. So did the counter-pressure from the West India Association and its allies. This was not a simple story of Scotland against slavery. It was a story of Scotland divided, as most societies are divided when money and conscience pull in opposite directions. The money was real. The conscience was real. The division was real. What is also real is the outcome. Scotland's commercial class, in the main, continued to profit from Caribbean slavery until abolition was forced upon it by law. By the end of the 18th century, Glasgow had been transformed. The city that had been a modest market town a century before was now a significant commercial power. Its streets were being rebuilt in stone. Its merchants dressed like gentlemen, and some of them were buying the titles to prove it. The wealth was visible everywhere. The sugar refineries on the Clyde, the grand townhouses of the merchant city, the country estates in the counties around the city, the new churches built with merchant donations, the clubs and societies where the West India interest met to discuss its affairs. All of it rested, at its foundation, on the same ground, the labor of enslaved Africans on plantations thousands of miles away. Men, women, and children who appear in the records as entries, as numbers, as property. The ledgers valued them in pounds sterling. The ledgers were wrong about what they were. They were people. They worked and suffered and died on those plantations. Their labor produced the sugar that was refined on the Clyde, sold at a profit, and converted into the buildings and estates and institutions we have been describing. Their names, for the most part, are not on the streets. The streets carry the names of the men who profited. That is the record as it stands. It is worth knowing that it stands that way. The city that grew wealthy in the 18th century still bears the marks of that wealth, not as guilt, exactly, and not as pride, as history, as something to be read clearly and carried honestly. We are reading it now in the quiet at low light. There is no comfort in it, nor is any comfort being offered. What is being offered is the plain truth of where things came from. The fortunes came home to Glasgow. They built the city. The people whose labor made those fortunes never came home. Many of them had no home to return to, having been taken from one continent and deposited on another to serve the interests of men they would never meet. That asymmetry is at the center of this story. The wealth moved freely across the Atlantic. The people did not. The year is now approaching 1791. The buildings are built. The streets are named. The West India interest is powerful and well-funded and confident in the permanence of the system it has constructed. On the island of Saint-Domingue in the French Caribbean, the people who have built that colony's extraordinary wealth are watching and listening and waiting. What happens next is the subject of part 2. But before we arrive there, we must sit for a moment with the world as it was on the eve of that rupture. The planters in their great houses, the enslaved in their quarters, the ships on the water, the money in the counting houses of Glasgow and London and Bordeaux. The system appears, to those who benefit from it, to be settled and permanent. It is not. It is carrying within it the conditions of its own destruction. But that story belongs to part 2. For now, the water runs toward the sea. The city is quiet. The ledgers are closed for the night. And somewhere in the dark, in the hills and fields of Saint-Domingue, something is beginning that will change everything. Tartan Lullaby, Haiti and the Scottish Caribbean Part 1, Block 4, Chapter 4, Saint-Domingue, the richest colony on earth. Chunks, tilde 2 900 words. Chunk 1, there is an island in the Caribbean. It sits between Cuba to the west and Puerto Rico to the east. The Spanish named it Hispaniola. By the late 18th century, the western third of that island carries a different name, a French name, Saint-Domingue. Chunk 2, it is, by any measure the world then uses, the most productive colony on earth, not the largest, not the oldest, but the most profitable, the most efficient, if efficiency means how much wealth can be extracted from a fixed area of ground in a single year. Chunk 3, the numbers are what they are. Saint-Domingue produces, at its height, roughly half of all the sugar consumed in Europe, half, and nearly half of its coffee. A single colony, smaller than the island of Ireland, feeds a continent its morning cup and sweetens its tables. Chunk 4, there are more than 7,000 plantations across this territory. Sugar, coffee, indigo, cotton. The soil is fertile beyond what European farmers know. The mountains catch rain. The valleys channel water to the cane fields. The land, in the right conditions, gives back whatever is put into it. Chunk 5, what is put into it is this: human beings, 500,000 of them by the 1780s, brought from West and Central Africa, brought against their will, brought in the holds of ships that most of them would never leave alive. Chunk 6, the trade route is well established by now. Ships leave the ports of France loaded with textiles, guns, and iron goods. They sail to the African coast. There, traders and African intermediaries exchange those goods for people. The ships then cross to Saint-Domingue. The people are sold. Chunk 7, the crossing takes weeks. The records suggest a mortality rate of somewhere between 10 and 20% on an average voyage. On a bad voyage, more. The people are confined below deck. They have no space to stand. The conditions are what anyone who has read an account of them cannot easily set aside. Chunk 8, those who survive the crossing are sold on the quayside at Cap Francaise or at the smaller port towns that dot the coast. Their names are not recorded by their buyers. Their buyers give them new names or simply assign them numbers in the plantation ledgers. The ledgers call them property. That is the word the ledgers use. Chunk 9, a plantation in Saint-Domingue in the late 18th century, is not an agricultural enterprise in any ordinary sense. It is closer to an industrial system. The cane must be planted, weeded, cut, carried, crushed, boiled, and refined. It runs without pause through the harvest season. The people who run it run without pause as well. Chunk 10, the figures on life expectancy are plainly reported by the planters themselves, who kept records because productivity mattered to them. An enslaved person arriving from Africa could expect, on the worst plantations, to survive perhaps 8 years. On better managed ones, longer. The planters note this without particular feeling. It is a calculation of replacement cost. Chunk 11, the consequence of those figures is that Saint-Domingue requires constant resupply. The population does not reproduce itself fast enough to replace those who die. The slave trade is not a one-off founding event. It is an ongoing system. Ships arrive every year. The numbers must be maintained. The machine must be fed. Chunk 12, the word machine is not chosen lightly. The planters themselves sometimes use it. They mean it as a compliment to their management. The machine runs, the sugar flows, the ships leave Saint-Domingue loaded, and the wealth that reaches France is counted in the tens of millions of livres every year. Chunk 13, let us be precise about the violence. There is a legal code in Saint-Domingue, the Code Noir, issued by France in 1685. It sets out rules for the treatment of enslaved people. It prohibits certain punishments. It requires that enslaved people be fed. On paper, it is a form of regulation. In practice, enforcement is left to the planters. Chunk 14, the planters are far from France. The colonial administration is local. The courts are local. The militia is local. The people who would be judged and the people doing the judging are largely the same people. The Code Noir is a document. The plantation is the reality. Chunk 15, what happens on the plantations is recorded in the accounts of travelers, in the testimonies of people who escaped, and in the proceedings of abolitionists who gathered evidence in the latter decades of the century. The punishments are not rumor, they are documented. They include mutilation, branding, and execution administered without appeal. Chunk 16, this is stated plainly because it happened. It is not stated to cause distress for its own sake. It is stated because the wealth that left Saint-Domingue and landed in Europe was built on this. The sugar in the cup, the coffee in the morning, the cloth and the credit, and the great houses of the merchant cities, all of it. Chunk 17, now let us look at who lives in this colony, because Saint-Domingue is not simply planters and enslaved people. It is a society of rigid and anxious stratification. There are roughly 4 groups, and the tension between them is one of the forces that will, in time, split the whole structure open. Chunk 18, at the top of the free population, the Grands Blancs, the Great Whites. The large plantation owners, the merchants, the men of property and local political power. They resent French control. They want more autonomy. Some of them, by the 1780s, are watching what is happening in the British colonies to the north and asking questions. Chunk 19 below them, the petits blancs, the small whites, artisans, overseers, small traders, the men who supervise the work but own little or none of the land. They have no wealth to speak of. What they have is whiteness, and they guard it with a ferocity that says everything about what little else they possess. Chunk 20, then there are the affranchis, the free people of color. This group is larger and wealthier than many outsiders expect. By the late 18th century, the free people of color number around 30,000. Some of them own plantations. Some of them own enslaved people. Under French law, they are free. Under colonial practice, they are diminished. Chunk 21, the free people of color cannot hold public office. They cannot sit with white colonists at the theater or in church. They cannot wear the same clothes. They cannot, in much of daily life, occupy the same spaces. The law is precise about this. The hierarchy is maintained with the same attention the planters give to their accounts. Chunk 22, many of the free people of color are the sons and daughters of planters, children of the violence that is inseparable from plantation life. Some have been educated in France. Some have money. All of them are told firmly and repeatedly that this does not matter, that the order is the order, that their place is fixed. Chunk 23, and then at the base of everything, the 500,000 enslaved people. They outnumber the free population roughly 10 to 1. They grow the food, cut the cane, distill the rum, carry the loads, maintain the houses, and produce the wealth upon which the entire structure rests. Without them, there is nothing. Chunk 24, within this 500,000, there is also a stratification, though it is one imposed by the planters rather than chosen. Those who work in the great house are separated from those who work the fields. Those born in the colony are separated from those recently arrived from Africa, who the records call bosales, a word meaning new and foreign. Chunk 25, the planters understand that division prevents unity. They cultivate it. Different groups are given different privileges. A trusted domestic servant may receive slightly better food, a better sleeping space. The calculation is always the same. Keep the lines between the groups firmer than the line between all of them and their enslavers. It is a strategy as old as empire. Chunk 26, and yet. The 500,000 are not passive. They are never passive. There are throughout the history of Saint-Domingue constant acts of resistance, slowing work without appearing to slow it, breaking tools, poisoning livestock, running away. The mountain forests of the interior harbor communities of people who have escaped and will not be returned. Chunk 27, these communities are called maroon settlements. In Saint-Domingue, they are present throughout the colonial period. The French conduct military campaigns against them. Some are destroyed, others persist and grow. The Maroons occupy the high ground in every sense. They are a constant reminder that the machine is not as total as the planters wish to believe. Chunk 28, there are names from this period worth recording. Macandal, a man enslaved on a plantation in the north, who escaped and led a campaign of resistance for nearly 2 decades before his capture and execution in 1758. The records suggest he was feared across the entire northern plain. His name does not appear in the ledgers. The ledgers have no column for a man like Macandal. Chunk 29, his campaign is remembered in part because it frightened the planter class enough to generate its own documentation. Letters, colonial reports, requests for troops. In trying to record their own fear, the planters recorded his existence. That is often how the history of resistance survives. Fragments, preserved in the evidence of those who wished to suppress it. Chunk 30, where do the Scots and the British fit into this picture? Saint-Domingue is a French colony, but the Caribbean is not a tidy system of separate national spheres. It is a world of trade, of smuggling, of shifting alliances, and of war. Britain and France fight each other across this century more often than they are at peace. Chunk 31, British merchants trade with Saint-Domingue where they can, legally or otherwise. The colony needs food, timber, and livestock that the French Caribbean cannot always supply. The British colonies in North America, before and after their independence, are close neighbors in commercial terms, and where commerce goes, Scots go. They are present in the margins of this world. Chunk 32, there are Scots in the ports of Saint-Domingue. Merchants, captains, agents, doctors, some work there for years. Some marry into the colonial world. Some carry back to Scotland not just money but knowledge, a precise and personal understanding of how the system works, what it costs, and who pays that cost. Chunk 33, there are British physicians in the colony. Some come as ship surgeons on slave vessels and remain. Others are hired by planters who need someone to keep their workforce alive long enough to be profitable. The medical records some of these men keep are among the most detailed accounts we have of conditions on the plantations. They are clinical documents. They are also indictments. Chunk 34, Britain and France fight over this part of the world at intervals across the century. British forces occupy parts of Hispaniola at different moments. During the 7 Years' War, ending 1763, Britain strips France of many Caribbean islands. Saint-Domingue survives as French, but the war reshapes the balance of power around it and tightens the British attention on what the French possess. Chunk 35, by the 1780s, Britain has lost its American colonies. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 ends that conflict. Many in London look southward toward the Caribbean, where the remaining empires are concentrated and where the wealth is still flowing. Saint-Domingue, in particular, is watched with something that is part envy and part calculation. Chunk 36, for Saint-Domingue, is extraordinary. Even the French acknowledge that they have built something that strains comprehension, a territory smaller than Wales generating wealth on this scale. The infrastructure required is correspondingly vast. Ports, roads, processing mills, warehouses, hospitals for the free, barracks for the militia. Chunk 37, the city of Cap Francaise on the northern coast, is known as the Paris of the Antilles. It has a theatre. It has a library. It has formal gardens and wide boulevards. The wealthy planters build townhouses alongside their country estates. They dress well, they eat well, they attend performances and debates. Chunk 38, This civilization rests entirely on what happens in the fields below the hills. The theater is paid for by the sugar. The library is paid for by the coffee. The wide boulevards are built and maintained by people who are not permitted to walk them freely. This is not contradiction. It is the point. The luxury is the proof of the system, and the system is the luxury's foundation. Chunk 39, the planter class of Saint-Domingue is, by the late 18th century, increasingly restless. They pay taxes to France. They trade under French restrictions. They are governed by administrators sent from Paris who may not understand or may not care about local conditions. They want more control. Some of them want independence. Chunk 40, the ideas of the Enlightenment are circulating in Saint-Domingue as they are circulating everywhere in the Atlantic world. Liberty, rights, the consent of the governed. The Grands Blancs read these ideas and apply them to themselves. The free people of color read them and ask why liberty stops at the color line. The enslaved people hear fragments and draw their own conclusions. The same words mean different things to everyone who hears them. Chunk 41, there are also, by this period, abolitionists at work in Europe. In Britain, a movement is forming. Quakers have long opposed the trade. Now Anglican voices join them. Granville Sharp. Thomas Clarkson. These are men gathering evidence, circulating pamphlets, and beginning the long work of building a public case. Chunk 42, the planters in Saint-Domingue follow this with alarm. Any weakening of the slave trade threatens the supply of people their system requires. They have lobbying operations in Paris. They have allies in London. They are not passive in the face of what they understand to be an existential threat to their world. Chunk 43, in France, as the 1780s end, the political situation is deteriorating. The crown is bankrupt. The Estates General is called for the first time in over a century. The debates that follow are about taxation, about representation, about the nature of liberty. These debates will, within months, become a revolution. Chunk 44, the revolution in France sends shockwaves directly into Saint-Domingue. Every group in the colony hears different things in the news from Paris. The Grands Blancs hear an opportunity for greater autonomy. The Petits Blancs hear validation of their anger. The free people of color hear a promise of rights that France may now be forced to honor. Chunk 45, and the 500,000 enslaved people hear something as well. The records are sparse on what precisely moved through the networks of the plantations, but information moves. It always has. People who are bought and sold still talk to each other. News from France arrives in the ports and does not stay in the ports. Chunk 46, there is a man whose name should be said here. Vincent Auge, a free man of color, educated in France, a man of property. He travels to Paris during the Revolution to petition for political rights for the free people of color. He is refused. He returns to Saint-Domingue. In 1790, he leads an uprising. Chunk 47, Auge is careful to say that his uprising is not about the enslaved. He wants rights for free people of color. He does not, in his public position, call for the end of slavery. This is noted by historians with varying interpretations. Whatever his private beliefs, his public position does not stop the colonial authorities from capturing and executing him. Chunk 48, Oge is executed in February 1791. His execution is public. His body is broken on the wheel, the method reserved for rebels and intended as a lesson to those who might follow. The lesson the colonial authorities intend is one of deterrence. The lesson that is actually absorbed is something else. Chunk 49, the colony is now on the edge of several crises at once. The Grands Blancs are in conflict with France. The Petits Blancs are in conflict with the Grands Blancs. The free people of color are in open rebellion and have been suppressed with notable violence. And the 500,000 enslaved people are watching all of this. They have always been watching. Chunk 50, the summer of 1791 approaches. Saint-Domingue is, on its surface, still functioning. The ships are still arriving. The sugar is still being cut. The wealth is still leaving. To a merchant in Bordeaux or a counting house in Glasgow, the colony looks as it has always looked. Profitable, ordered, permanent. Chunk 51, but the system that produces this appearance has been grinding for generations against the will of the people it consumes. It has survived through division, through violence, through the constant work of maintaining a hierarchy that serves only the few at the cost of the many. It survives by suppression. Suppression is not the same as settlement. Chunk 52, there are, in these months, meetings taking place in the interior, in the hills above the northern plain. Away from the roads, away from the town, away from the ears of the overseers. The records come later, pieced together from fragments and testimonies. What is certain is that people are meeting, that plans are being made, that something has been decided. Chunk 53, on the night of the 14th of August, 1791, in a place called Bois Cayman, several hundred enslaved people gather. There is a ceremony. There is a covenant. The names of those who led it are disputed by the historical record in some particulars, but the gathering itself is documented. It is a beginning. Chunk 54, what follows in the days after that night, will change the Caribbean, will change France, will change Britain, will change the map of empire, and will send consequences all the way to the counting houses and the streets and the very foundations of cities that believed themselves safe and distant from what they had built. That is for part 2. Chapter 5, The World Before the Storm. Saint-Domingue in the 1780s. The colony the French called the Pearl of the Antilles, 1/3 of all French foreign trade, half of Europe's sugar and coffee. The numbers are everywhere in the colonial ledgers. What the ledgers do not hold is the weight of what produced them. 400,000 enslaved Africans and their descendants, 40,000 white colonists, 30,000 free people of color, many of them mixed race, some of them property owners themselves, some of them enslaved people holders. 3 worlds on one island, each pressing against the others. The planters called it order. It was not order. It was a structure held in place by law, by violence, and by the constant, exhausting effort of those at the bottom to survive, to remember, and to keep something of themselves alive. We know the plantation records. We know the export figures. What survives of the interior lives of enslaved people is fragmentary, partial, often mediated through the eyes of those who held power over them. But fragments are not nothing. We work with what the record kept, and we honor what it missed. The enslaved population was not one people, it was many. Fon, Yoruba, Akan, Wolof, Bambara, Congo. Languages, cosmologies, ways of marking time and ceremony that had been carried across the ocean at enormous cost and not surrendered. The crossing had been designed to break those connections. People were separated from kin, from language groups, from the familiar. It was deliberate. A person who cannot speak to their neighbor, who shares no ceremony, no name for God, no common song, is harder to organize. The planters understood this. And yet, language bends and combines. Ceremony finds its time. The people of Saint-Domingue built something new from the fragments of what had been taken, a Creole language that belonged to no single origin and to everyone who needed it. A spiritual practice that the records call Vodou, rooted in West and Central African traditions, shaped by the particular pressure of this island. The ceremonies happened at night. They happened in the hours when the overseers slept, when the plantation's watching eye was closed. They were not merely religious. They were a place where the self could breathe, where a person was not property, but a person standing before the sacred, in the company of others who knew what they carried. The records suggest they were constant. The colonists feared them. They passed laws against nighttime gatherings, against drumming, against the practices they could not name or understand. The laws were not enough. Some things cannot be legislated out of people. The mountains helped. Saint-Domingue is not flat. The interior rises sharply from the coastal plains into forest, into places where a plantation's authority grew thin with distance. People ran to those mountains. Not all of them were recaptured. The communities that formed in the mountains are called maroon communities. Maroon, from the Spanish cimarron, meaning something like untamed, escaped, beyond reach. The name was given by those they had escaped. The people themselves had their own names, their own structures, their own ways of governing a life outside the system. In Jamaica, the Maroon communities had fought the British to a formal treaty. In Saint-Domingue, they were smaller, more scattered, but present. They were a constant proof that the system was not total, that a person could, at enormous risk, refuse it. The most significant of the Maroon leaders the record's name is a man called Macandal. He had lost an arm in a mill accident. He escaped sometime in the 1750s and lived for years in the mountains, moving between plantations, building a network, planning. Macandal understood poison. He understood the plants of the island and what they could do. The records suggest he organized a campaign to poison the water supplies of the white colonists. The campaign, they say, went on for years before it was detected. The death toll among colonists and their animals was real enough to produce panic. He was captured in 1758. He was burned at the stake in Cap Francaise. The records say that when the fire was lit, he freed himself from the post, briefly, before he was held again. The enslaved people watching are said to have believed he could not be killed, that he had passed into the spiritual world and would return. Whether the story of his escape is exactly as told, we cannot say. What we can say is that people kept it, that a belief in Macandal's power and return was carried forward into the 1780s, that the memory of him was part of the interior world the plantation system could not reach. By the 1780s, the whispered networks were more than memory. They were present, active, stretching across the colony. Messages passed between plantations in ways the overseers could not track. A song could carry information, a pattern in cloth. The ordinary transactions of an enslaved person permitted to move between estates. The people at the bottom of Saint-Domingue's world were not passive. They were watching, talking, calculating. They knew the geography of the island. They knew the planters' habits. They knew where the weapons were kept. They were people paying attention to a world that refused to see them as people. Now consider the free people of color, 30,000 of them, as noted. Their position was one of constant legal humiliation. Many were literate, French-speaking, Catholic, educated in France. Some owned land. Some, to their enduring shame in history's ledger, owned enslaved people themselves. But the colonial code treated them as categorically inferior to any white person. They could not sit beside white colonists in public. They could not dress in certain ways. They could not hold certain offices. A free person of color, however wealthy, however educated, was legally subordinate to the most recently arrived and destitute white migrant. This was the logic of race written into law, and it created an extraordinary pressure. The free people of color were not enslaved. They were also not free, not in any full sense. They occupied a middle that neither side trusted and that the law worked constantly to remind them was not solid ground. In the 1780s, they began to organize. A man named Vincent Augué, the son of a free woman of color and educated in France, was among those who pressed for rights. He was present in Paris in 1789 when the revolution there upended the world's assumptions about what a citizen was and what a citizen deserved. The Declaration of the Rights of Man, Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité, the words crossed the Atlantic. They were read in Saint-Domingue. The question that formed was immediate and hard. Did those rights belong only to white Frenchmen? The white colonists in Saint-Domingue said yes. The free people of color said no. The enslaved people of Saint-Domingue heard all of it. Augué returned to Saint-Domingue in 1790. He raised a small armed uprising demanding political rights for free people of color. He was careful to say, too careful, that he was not calling for the end of slavery. He was asking only for his class to be counted. The uprising was crushed. Augué was captured, tried, and publicly executed in February 1791. Broken on the wheel in the open square of Cap Francaise before a crowd that included enslaved people who had been made to watch. His execution was an answer. The colonial order was saying, there is no negotiation. There is no middle ground where the structure bends. What you are will not change because you asked politely. What it produced, in those who watched, was a reckoning of a different kind. And now we reach the summer of 1791. The island is tight. the free people of color have seen their most prominent spokesman executed. The enslaved majority has spent 3 decades since Mackandal building networks, holding ceremonies, watching and remembering. The language of liberty is coming in from France, and the colonists are trying to keep it contained, which is like trying to hold water in cupped hands. The records tell us of a gathering in the night of 14 August 1791, in a forest clearing called Bois Caiman in the north of the island. A ceremony led by a man named Dutty Bouckman, an enslaved man, a coachman by the brutal logic of the colony's occupational ledger, a person of evident authority among those who came. The records of Bois Caiman are partial and were later embellished and distorted by those who wished to frame what followed as something primitive, as something other. We use them carefully. What the records suggest is this: people gathered. They held ceremony. They made commitments to each other. There was a storm that night, which is a weather fact, and also, in the telling, something more. Bouckman spoke. What he said was not preserved verbatim or not with certainty. What was preserved in memory and later written down is the sense of it, that the God who had watched over them was not the colonists' God, that the colonists' God demanded crime, that a different force called on them to act. We do not know exactly what was said. We know that those who gathered were people who had been calculating for a long time, who had the networks, the geography, the months of quiet preparation. Bois Caiman was not a moment of sudden decision. It was the public naming of what had already been built in the dark. 8 days later, on the night of 22 August 1791, the revolution began. The fires were not yet lit when Bouckman's gathering ended. The island was still. The plantations were quiet in the way they were always quiet at night, the quiet of a place that enforced silence over millions of people. But the night of 14 August was already different from other nights, not in what was visible, in what was decided. We stand here at the end of part 1. We have followed a long thread. Scotland's hunger for sugar in the 17th century, the Atlantic trade that answered it, the men from Glasgow and Ayrshire who sailed west and stayed and built fortunes on the backs of human beings, the wealth that came home and became streets and buildings and university libraries. We followed that wealth to Saint-Domingue, the most productive slave colony in the Atlantic world. We met the system at its height, the production, the brutality, the calculus that moved human beings across ledgers like grain. And then we stayed with the people the ledgers counted but did not see, the man who remembered a different name for God, the woman who kept a ceremony alive in the hours before the overseer woke, the children who grew up speaking a language that had not existed before the crossing, because their grandparents had needed a way to speak to each other. The maroon in the mountains, the free person of color pressing for rights in a language the colonists had taught them and then tried to use against them. The networks spread across the colony's geography like roots. The memory of Mackandal, the execution of Ogay, the gathering at Bois Caiman. All of it leads to one night, the night of 22 August 1791, when the fires were lit and the world the planters had built began to come apart. That is part 2. For now, the island is still. History is holding its breath. The plantation houses are quiet. The mountains are dark. The sea moves against the coast as it has always moved, indifferent to what human beings have done to each other on this small piece of land. Part 2 will bring the revolution, what happened, who led it, what it cost, and what it made. The first successful revolution of enslaved people in the Atlantic world, the founding of Haiti, and what Scotland's part in that story means if you are honest enough to look at it. But that is tomorrow night. WindDOWN. You have sat with something difficult tonight. This chapter asked a great deal of attention, and it deserved to be heard with attention. Thank you for staying with it. Sleep history is sometimes beautiful. The kings and the poems and the long ago light on old stone. Sometimes it is like tonight, the thing that actually happened, told plainly without looking away. Both matter. The record needs to hold both. The people in this story are not distant. Their world made the one we live in. The wealth from these islands is in the architecture of Glasgow and Edinburgh. The legal language of property applied to human beings shaped the legal language that came after it. Knowing this is not comfortable, but discomfort is not the same as despair. The people who survived the system, who kept the ceremonies, who built the networks, who gathered at Boys Cayman, they were not defeated. They were preparing. Part 2 will tell you what they did with what they had prepared. It will tell you about men and women who built a nation out of a revolution against forces that were enormous and ruthless and were still, in the end, not enough. For now, let the story rest where it is. On the night before, the island still, the stars where they always are. You have been honest company tonight. That is not a small thing. Let the history settle. Let the images quiet. The sea is still moving against the coast of the island. The mountains are there as they were. The people who lived through this were real, and they were not only their suffering, they were their survival, their ceremony, their names. When you are ready for sleep, let those things be the last thought, not the ledgers, the people. This is Tartan Lullaby. Part 2 comes tomorrow night. Sleep well. That's where we'll leave it for tonight. The story is finished, but the night isn't, so let this play on as long as it helps. If Tartan Lullaby has been good company, you're welcome to subscribe so the next story finds you. There's no rush. If you'd like to see the landscapes that go with these stories, the art prints are at Tartan Lullaby Art on Etsy, with mood boards and stills on Pinterest under the same name. The links are in the description below. Until next time, thank you for listening. Sleep well, all is well.